A 90-pound Austrian teenager once stood in front of a cracked bathroom mirror in a small town outside Graz and told himself out loud that he would leave that house, leave that country, and become the strongest man anyone had ever seen. 6 decades later, that same man stands in a Los Angeles gym at 79 years old, moving slower, breathing harder, carrying a chest full of surgical scars beneath a t-shirt, and the world still calls him invincible. He is not. He never really was. And the story of how Arnold Schwarzenegger got from that bathroom mirror to this quiet, aching present is one of the most emotionally complicated journeys in modern celebrity history. Not because he failed, but because he succeeded at almost everything except the one thing that might have mattered most. To understand why Arnold at 79 feels different from Arnold at any other age, you have to understand what he represented for nearly 50 years. He was not simply an actor or a bodybuilder or a politician. He was, for millions of people around the world, a walking argument that the human body and the human will could overcome anything. Bullets, explosions, poverty, ridicule, foreign accents, impossible odds. In the movies and often in life, Arnold found a way through. That mythology was built so carefully over so many decades that watching him now, slower and visibly marked by time, produces a kind of grief that has very little to do with pity and everything to do with recognition. If Arnold Schwarzenegger cannot outrun time, what chance does anyone else have? The beginning of that story is far less glamorous than the ending most people know. Arnold Alois Schwarzenegger was born on July 30th, 1947, in the small Austrian village of Thal, in a country still digging itself out of the wreckage of the Second World War. Food was scarce. Money was scarcer. His father, Gustav Schwarzenegger, was a local police chief who had served during the war and who ran his household with a rigid, almost military discipline. In interviews and in his own memoir, Total Recall, My Unbelievably True Life Story, published in 2012, Arnold has described a childhood defined by strict rules, physical punishment, and an atmosphere where affection was rarely spoken aloud. He was expected to earn approval, not simply receive it. There was no room in that house for a boy to be soft, uncertain, or afraid. It would be easy to reduce that childhood to a simple explanation: hard father, driven son. But the truth Arnold has described over the years is more layered than that. He has said that his father's discipline gave him structure at a time when structure was one of the only things a poor Austrian family could offer. But he has also acknowledged, particularly in later interviews and documentaries, that the emotional distance in that home taught him to bury vulnerability rather than express it. Long before he built the body that would make him famous, he had already learned to build walls. That habit of self-protection through toughness would follow him for the rest of his life, showing up not only in the gym, but in every relationship he would ever have. As a teenager, Arnold discovered bodybuilding almost by accident, through magazines and a local gym, and something in him recognized immediately that this was his way out. He has spoken often about seeing photographs of champions like Reg Park, and realizing that a body built through sheer repetition and willpower could become a passport to a completely different life. While other boys in his town dreamed modestly, Arnold constructed an entire plan in his head. Build the greatest physique in the world, use it to get to America, use America to get into the movies, and use the movies to become someone the world could not ignore. It sounds almost absurd for a teenager in a poor Austrian village to have mapped that out with such specificity. But that is exactly what friends and biographers describe him doing. Training for Arnold was never simply exercise. It became a form of escape and a form of proof. Every additional pound of muscle was evidence that the life he had been born into did not have to be the life he would die in. He has described training through injuries, training through exhaustion, training in secret when others thought he should be studying or working a more sensible job. Behind the swagger that would later define his public image, biographers and those close to him in his early years have suggested there was something closer to fear, a fear of remaining ordinary, of being trapped in the same small world his father had lived in. That fear and the ambition produced came at a cost long before Arnold ever became famous. His relationship with his older brother, Meinhard, was shaped by the same strict household, but the two brothers took very different paths. Arnold left. Meinhard largely stayed closer to home. In 1971, Meinhard was killed in a car accident in Austria. Arnold, by then building his career and his life in the United States, has spoken about how the loss affected him from a distance, complicated further by the fact that he was not there, not long after. His father, Gustav, died as well, and Arnold made a decision not to return to Austria for the funeral. That choice followed him for years, interpreted by some as coldness and by others as the behavior of a man who had trained himself, quite literally, to keep moving forward no matter what stood behind him. By the time Arnold arrived in the United States in 1968, he had already become one of the most dominant competitive bodybuilders in the world, eventually winning the Mr. Olympia title 7 times. But arriving in America did not mean the doors simply opened. Hollywood, when he first approached it, treated him as a curiosity rather than a leading man. His accent was considered a liability. His name was considered too foreign, too difficult to market. His enormous physique, once his greatest asset on a bodybuilding stage, was viewed by casting directors as unnatural and off-putting for mainstream film audiences. In his early film Hercules in New York, released in 1970, his dialogue was reportedly dubbed over because filmmakers doubted audiences could understand him at all. For a young man who had spent years constructing an identity of total control, being told his own voice was not good enough must have been a particular kind of humiliation. Arnold's response to that rejection reveals something important about who he was underneath the muscle. Rather than trying to hide his differences, he doubled down on building leverage in every other area of his life. He studied English relentlessly. He studied acting. He earned a business degree through correspondence courses and began investing seriously in real estate long before real estate was a fashionable celebrity hobby, eventually amassing enough independent wealth that he no longer had to accept roles out of financial desperation. This mattered enormously, because it meant that when Hollywood finally did come calling, Arnold could afford to wait for the right part rather than take whatever scraps were offered to him. That right part arrived in 1982 with Conan the Barbarian, a role that turned Arnold's foreignness and physical scale from liabilities into his single greatest asset. But it was 1984 as The Terminator, directed by James Cameron, that changed the entire trajectory of his life. Cameron reportedly saw something in Arnold that other directors had missed, that his stiffness, his accent, and his sheer physical presence could be transformed into something genuinely unsettling and iconic if used correctly. The film gave Arnold relatively few lines, but the ones he had, delivered in that unmistakable voice, became part of the cultural landscape. The phrase, "I'll be back," turned into one of the most quoted lines in movie history. The very voice that Hollywood had once tried to erase became his signature. What followed across the 1980s and into the 1990s was one of the most successful runs any action star has ever had. Commando, Predator, The Running Man, Total Recall, Terminator 2, Judgment Day, and True Lies cemented Arnold as arguably the biggest box office draw in the world during that era. Audiences did not simply enjoy watching him. They trusted him. No matter how impossible the danger, Arnold Schwarzenegger's characters found a way to survive, and there was something deeply comforting in that certainty for audiences living to their own far less controllable lives. But that image had a price, and much of it was paid by his body. Years of extreme weightlifting during his bodybuilding career, followed by physically punishing stunt work across dozens of action films, placed enormous cumulative strain on his joints, his spine, and his cardiovascular system. What audiences saw on screen was a man who appeared indestructible. What very few people knew at the time was that Arnold had been born with a congenital heart defect involving his aortic valve, a bicuspid valve, present since birth, quietly ticking beneath the surface of a body that had become the global symbol of physical perfection. The contrast is almost impossible to overstate. The most physically dominant movie star on the planet was carrying a structural weakness in the one organ that mattered more than any bicep or shoulder ever could. In 1997, while still one of the most recognizable actors alive, Arnold underwent open-heart surgery to replace that defective valve. It was, by his own later description, one of the first moments in his adult life where sheer will and discipline could not solve the problem in front of him. No amount of training could repair a valve. No amount of confidence could guarantee he would wake up from the operation the way he expected to. For a man whose entire identity had been organized around control, controlling his body, his image, his narrative, it was a genuinely frightening surrender. He recovered, and true to form, he returned to work quickly enough that the public largely absorbed it as just another obstacle Arnold had overcome. But the scar remained a permanent, physical reminder that the strongest man in the room was still, underneath everything, breakable. 2 years before that surgery, in 1986, Arnold had married Maria Shriver, a respected broadcast journalist and a member of one of America's most storied political families, the Kennedys, on paper, and for many years in public. The marriage looked like the union of two extraordinary American success stories, Hollywood glamour meeting political royalty. Together they raised 4 children, Catherine, Christina, Patrick, and Christopher, and built a public image of a disciplined, loving, high-achieving family. For a boy who had once imagined America as an almost mythical land of opportunity, marrying into the Kennedy family must have felt, at the time, like the ultimate confirmation that he had truly arrived. In 2003, Arnold made a decision that seemed almost as improbable as his original journey from Austria to Hollywood. He entered politics, running in California's historic gubernatorial recall election. Critics dismissed him immediately as a celebrity vanity project, arguing that decades of action films provided no meaningful preparation for governing the 5th largest economy in the world. Arnold, who had spent his entire life converting doubt into fuel, ran a campaign built on the same charisma, humor, and command of the camera that had made him a movie star, and he won. He served 2 terms as governor of California, from 2003 to 2011, navigating budget crises, natural disasters, and one of the most politically divided electorates in the country. It was, by any objective measure, another improbable chapter in an already improbable life. But governing was not a film set, and there was no script guaranteeing a triumphant final act. California's budget problems were structural and brutal. Every policy decision alienated some constituency or another. The same charm that had won Arnold the office could not, by itself, resolve competing interests or balance a state budget in the middle of a national financial crisis. The pressure of the office was constant, and it coincided with a period in which old allegations about inappropriate behavior toward women during his Hollywood years resurfaced, forcing him to publicly address conduct that had gone largely unexamined during his rise to fame. Political opponents scrutinized every aspect of his record and his character in a way his film career never had. Throughout the governorship, Maria Shriver stood beside him at nearly every major public moment, and from the outside, the marriage appeared to be weathering the pressure. She brought her own credibility as a journalist and her deep understanding of public life, having grown up inside one of the most scrutinized families in American history, but maintaining a public partnership, while under that level of sustained pressure exact a private toll that cameras rarely capture. Years of relentless schedules, competing demands, and the accumulated weight of decades spent building one ambitious project after another, bodybuilding, then film, then politics, had left very little room for the kind of ordinary, unremarkable time that sustains a marriage. Arnold's entire adult identity had been organized around forward motion, around the next goal, the next title, the next campaign. That same restless drive that built an extraordinary public career may have quietly starved the private relationships meant to anchor it. When Arnold left the governor's office in January 2011, it should have marked a moment of celebratory return. Back to film, back to business, back to an intact family waiting for him. Instead, within months, the most damaging chapter of his personal life became public. Arnold and Maria announced their separation, and shortly afterward, it was revealed that Arnold had fathered a child, a son named Joseph Baena, with a member of the family's household staff, years earlier during his marriage. The revelation was not simply a scandal in the tabloid sense. It was a collapse of an image that had been carefully, deliberately constructed over 25 years. The disciplined family man standing beside his accomplished wife and 4 children. This was not an obstacle Arnold could out-train or out-charm. It was a direct consequence of his own choices. Hidden for years while he continued to appear publicly as a devoted husband and father. For Maria Shriver, the pain of that disclosure extended well beyond the infidelity itself. It was the years of concealment that made the wound so deep. The knowledge that a truth of that magnitude had existed inside her own household while she stood beside her husband at public events, believing, as far as the world knew, in the life they had built together. The story instantly became a subject of intense media scrutiny, with every detail of the marriage's collapse dissected publicly. The Kennedy family, no strangers to public tragedy across generations, faced a wound that was intensely, uncomfortably personal rather than historical or political. Arnold, to his credit, did not attempt to minimize or explain away what he had done. He publicly accepted responsibility, describing the affair and its concealment as a serious failure on his part. But acknowledgement, however sincere, does not undo 25 years of trust or erase the years his children spent learning the truth in the full glare of international media attention. His marriage was effectively over, even though the legal divorce would not be finalized until 2021, a full decade later. Following a long and complicated process during which Arnold and Maria continued to share the responsibilities of raising and later celebrating milestones with their 4 adult children. What followed for Arnold was a kind of challenge he had never faced before, one that could not be solved through ambition, discipline, or sheer force of will. There was no next trophy to win, no election that could restore what had been broken. Rebuilding any form of trust with his children and maintaining a workable relationship with Maria required an entirely different set of skills than the ones that had built his career. Patience, humility, and a willingness to sit with consequences that could not be reversed no matter how hard he worked. Over the years that followed, Arnold's relationship with his 4 children with Maria evolved as they grew into adulthood. Catherine became a published author and later married actor Chris Pratt. Christina pursued work in media and advocacy. Patrick built a career spanning acting and business ventures. Christopher has largely stayed outside the constant attention that follows the rest of the family. Arnold has spoken with visible pride about each of them in interviews over the years, even as he has acknowledged that pride does not erase the damage his choices caused. Trust, once broken at that scale, does not return through grand gestures. It returns, if it returns at all, through small, repeated actions over long stretches of time. Showing up, staying present, and accepting that forgiveness, if it comes on its own schedule and not his. His relationship with Joseph Baena, the son at the center of the original scandal, also developed in public view as Joseph grew into adulthood. Joseph pursued bodybuilding and acting himself, and the physical resemblance between father and son became impossible to ignore in photographs of the two training together. For some observers, those images represented something genuinely moving, a father accepting full responsibility and building an honest relationship with a son he had once kept hidden. For others, they remain an uncomfortable reminder of exactly how that relationship had come to exist in the first place. Both readings can be true simultaneously. Human relationships rarely sort themselves neatly into categories of triumph or failure, and the bond between Arnold and Joseph does not erase the pain the affair caused Maria and their other children, just as that pain does not make the bond itself any less genuine. As Arnold moved into his 60s and 70s, Hollywood itself had changed around him. He continued acting, appearing in the Expendables franchise, The Last Stand, Escape Plan, and later Terminator sequels. But the era of the action superstar he had helped define was fading, replaced by younger performers and a very different kind of blockbuster filmmaking. Audiences still turned out for nostalgia, still wanted to see Arnold on screen, but the films themselves increasingly acknowledged, rather than concealed, the passage of time. Directors could still use his presence and his humor, but they could no longer pretend he was the same man who had emerged from flames in Terminator 2. For an actor whose entire brand had been built on projecting indestructibility, adjusting to visibly, publicly aging on screen required its own quiet form of humility. Then, in 2018, Arnold faced a health crisis that made the fragility beneath the myth impossible to ignore. He entered the hospital for what was intended to be a relatively minor, minimally invasive procedure to replace a pulmonary valve. During the operation, complications arose, and doctors were forced to perform emergency open-heart surgery. Arnold later described waking up to learn that what should have been a routine procedure had turned into something far more serious, leaving him with a large surgical incision and a recovery process that started from almost nothing. He needed help simply walking short distances down a hospital corridor. The same man who had once lifted extraordinary weights and performed his own physically demanding stunts now measuring progress in single steps. Arnold approached that recovery with the same mentality that had shaped every other chapter of his life, breaking an overwhelming challenge into small, manageable goals and pushing through them one at a time. But this recovery was different in a fundamental way. He was not training for a competition or preparing for a role. He was working simply to regain the basic physical independence that most people never have to think about. The experience forced him to confront mortality in a way that fame, muscle, and decades of on-screen invincibility had never required. Death for Arnold had always been something to talk about dismissively, an abstraction easily brushed aside. In that hospital bed, it became immediate and physically real. That was not his final encounter with serious heart trouble. In 2020, Arnold underwent yet another procedure, this time to replace his aortic valve again as the earlier replacement reached the end of its functional life. He shared photographs afterward of himself walking through the city during recovery, publicly thanking the medical staff who had cared for him, projecting the same resilience he always had. But the deeper truth beneath those optimistic images was harder to ignore. The man whose entire career had depended on appearing physically unbreakable had now survived multiple major interventions on the organ that kept him alive, each one a direct reminder that his body, extraordinary as it was, remained subject to the same biological limits as everyone else's. These repeated confrontations with his own mortality gradually reshaped what strength even meant to Arnold. In his younger years, strength had been something visible and measurable. The size of muscle, the weight on a bar, box office numbers, election results. In his later years, strength became quieter and far less photogenic. It meant getting out of a hospital bed unassisted. It meant accepting help without resentment. It meant following a doctor's instructions instead of his own instincts. It meant continuing to walk into a gym without pretending his body was the same one that had won 7 Mr. Olympia titles. His approach to training itself evolved accordingly. Arnold has remained publicly committed to fitness well into his late 70s, but the heavy competitive lifting of his youth gave way to more controlled, sustainable movement focused on preserving mobility and independence rather than building maximum size. For a man whose identity had been constructed almost entirely around physical transformation, that shift required genuine active emotional adjustment. Aging asked people to let go of earlier versions of themselves. And for Arnold, letting go of the bodybuilder's mindset while still walking into the same gyms where he once trained as a champion carried its own quiet difficulty. Rather than framing this later chapter purely as loss, Arnold has increasingly focused his public energy on usefulness. Through his newsletter, Arnold's Pump Club, his environmental advocacy, his continued charitable work, and frequent public appearances, he has encouraged people to take consistent action rather than wait for perfect circumstances or motivation. The core principles he preaches remain remarkably consistent with the ones that shaped his own life in the beginning. Set a clear vision, work at it every single day, ignore unnecessary negativity, and increasingly emphasize in his later years, find ways to be useful to other people rather than measuring success purely by personal accolades. His grandchildren have added a dimension to his later life that trophies and box office records never could. The man once globally recognized as a ruthless cybernetic assassin and a sword-wielding barbarian now appears, in family photographs and public comments, in a considerably softer role of grandfather. There is a tenderness in the way he speaks about his children and grandchildren that stands in visible contrast with the controlled, image-conscious persona he maintained for most of his career. That tenderness exists alongside an acknowledged regret that he cannot fully separate from it. Pride in the family relationships that have survived, paired with the understanding that his own choices cause damage that time alone cannot fully repair. That is in many ways the most quietly heartbreaking part of Arnold Schwarzenegger's story at 79. He escaped poverty. He conquered a global sport. He became one of the most successful movie stars in the world. He was elected governor of the largest state in America. He survived multiple life-threatening heart surgeries and walked out of every hospital room he entered. And yet the wounds that have proven most resistant to healing were not inflicted by his difficult childhood, by Hollywood's early rejection, or by disease. They were self-inflicted, the result of choices made during the years when he held the most power and the most trust, and they are choices that no later success, however extraordinary, can fully undo. There is a broader lesson embedded in that contradiction, one that biographers and commentators have returned to repeatedly when examining Arnold's life. Relentless ambition can rescue a person from genuinely difficult circumstances. It can build discipline, create extraordinary opportunity, and produce achievements that once seemed impossible. But when ambition never learns to rest, when the next goal always feels more urgent than the people already in the room, it can quietly make ordinary relationships feel secondary to pursuit of the next milestone. Public admiration, Arnold's life suggests, can become far easier to chase than the slower, less glamorous work of private honesty. By his late 70s, Arnold has appeared increasingly willing to sit with these contradictions publicly rather than resolve them into a tidy narrative. He is, at once, a symbol of extraordinary self-discipline and a man who failed to master some of his own impulses at a critical moment. He is a former public official who built a reputation around responsibility and accountability, and a husband who caused serious, lasting harm to people who trusted him most. He is physically powerful by any ordinary standard for his age, and medically vulnerable in ways that required multiple emergency interventions just to keep him alive. He remains surrounded by admirers across the world, and he has, by his own account, experienced particular loneliness that follows the loss of marriage built over 25 years. None of these contradictions have destroyed his public legacy. If anything, they have made it more recognizably human. For decades, audiences loved Arnold because he seemed to exist outside the normal rules that govern everyone else's life. Impervious to injury, impervious to doubt, impervious to failure. As he has aged and as the full, complicated record of his life has become public, a different kind of admiration has taken shape. One rooted not in the illusion of perfection, but in the visible evidence of survival after imperfection. He has shown, publicly and repeatedly, that a person can cause real harm, face real consequences, endure real physical decline, and still choose to keep showing up rather than disappearing from view. Time, of course, keeps moving regardless of how anyone chooses to respond to it. Many of the people who shaped Arnold's greatest years, in bodybuilding, in film, and in politics, have aged alongside him or are no longer here at all. The industry that made him one of the most famous men on the planet has changed dramatically, populated now by performers who first encountered Arnold not as the world's biggest action star, but as an aging internet personality, a former governor, or simply a recognizable older man doing bicep curls at a public gym. That shift carries its own quiet sadness. Every cultural icon eventually becomes history rather than headline news. And Arnold, who understood the mechanics of fame better than almost anyone of his generation, cannot fully escape that gradual transition either. Instead of resisting that shift, Arnold has increasingly directed his remaining public influence toward encouraging others rather than centering himself. His public messaging in recent years leans less on personal dominance and more on consistency, optimism, civic responsibility, and the value of small, repeatable habits. He has also become notably more direct about the realities of aging rather than performing enthusiasm about it. He has acknowledged in interviews that looking at old photographs from his bodybuilding or early film years can be genuinely painful because they preserve a version of himself that no longer exists and that will never exist again. The body that once represented an almost impossible physical standard has, like every other body eventually does, become a smaller, changed version of what it once was. And yet, he keeps walking into the gym. That single, repeated choice reveals something important about the difference between vanity and identity. Arnold no longer trains with any expectation of returning to competitive form. He trains because the act of training connects him to the person he has always understood himself to be, regardless of what the mirror shows. The gym was the very first place where he learned, as a teenager in Austria, that pain could be converted into progress. Decades later, it remains one of the few places where routine and effort still translate directly into a felt sense of control, even as so much else in his life has settled into territory that effort alone cannot resolve. This same clear-eyed realism has shaped the way Arnold talks about death itself. He has never romanticized mortality or pretended it is something that can be outworked or intimidated into retreat. He understands, in a way his younger self likely could not, that every person eventually arrives at the same conclusion regardless of fame, wealth, muscle mass, or political achievement. That understanding has not made him hopeless. If anything, by his own description, it has made the time that remains feel more valuable rather than less. A shared meal with his children, an ordinary conversation with an old friend, a morning bicycle ride through Los Angeles, now carry a weight that no additional award or box office record could replicate. His role as a grandfather has reinforced that shift in perspective more than perhaps any other relationship in his later life. Grandchildren offer a kind of legacy that no film franchise or political term can replace, because they represent continuation that will extend well beyond Arnold's own lifetime. Through them, he has been able to see, in a very direct and personal way, that a life well lived is measured not only by individual accomplishment, but by what one generation manages to pass down to the next, in both its strengths and its acknowledged failures. Family, though, remains simultaneously the site of his greatest joy and his deepest regret. Arnold has been consistently open about the fact that the breakdown of his marriage to Maria Shriver was a direct result of his own choices, not simply bad luck or unfortunate circumstance. Speaking honestly about that responsibility, however, does not guarantee restoration of what was lost. Maria has built a life of her own, separate from him, over the years since their separation. Their children carry memories of that period that are, by their own accounts and by outside observation, both genuinely loving and genuinely painful at once. Arnold can attend family milestones, remain present in his children's and grandchildren's lives, and continue working toward whatever version of reconciliation is possible. What he cannot do, no matter how much wealth, fame, or determination he has accumulated, is return to the years before the truth became public and rewrite what happened there. That singular limitation may be the most emotionally significant thing about Arnold Schwarzenegger's story as he moves through his late 70s. For most of his life, his defining trait was an almost total confidence that hard work and discipline could resolve nearly any problem placed in front of him. Age, surgery, scandal, and the slow erosion of a marriage he once described as central to his identity have taught him a harder, more complicated truth. Some forms of damage can only be acknowledged honestly, not undone through effort. His story has shifted, gradually and unmistakably, from a narrative organized entirely around winning to one about how a person keeps living meaningfully after failure, after the loss of physical invincibility, and after fulfillment of nearly every ambition he ever set out to achieve. At 79, Arnold Schwarzenegger is still standing, still training most mornings, still speaking publicly, still visibly trying to be useful to the people and causes around him. But the emotional weight of watching him now comes specifically from understanding everything standing quietly behind that familiar smile. A difficult and disciplined childhood, an almost unbelievable rise from obscurity to global fame, a family shattered by his own choices, and only partially rebuilt, a chest marked by more than one emergency surgery, and the accumulating, silent pressure time that no amount of willpower has ever been able to negotiate with. He once promised, in the role that made him a household name, that he would be back. Decades later, his own life has quietly taught him, and by extension all of us watching, that no one gets to keep coming back forever. Perhaps the most unexpected chapter of Arnold's long and improbable life is not the fame, the wealth, or the political power he accumulated along the way. It is the fact that after spending decades building an identity almost entirely around winning, he eventually had to learn how to live with things that simply could not be won. There is no championship trophy for surviving regret. There is no box office record for accepting responsibility years after the damage was already done. There is no guaranteed happy ending waiting at the close of a family relationship that has been genuinely, deeply hurt. Arnold could train harder than almost anyone alive, but that discipline could never force forgiveness on someone else's timeline. He could deliver a powerful, well-rehearsed speech in front of thousands of people, but he could never simply talk the past out of existence. That reality demanded a very different kind of discipline than the one that built his career. One centered on remaining present even when the world kept reminding him of his failures rather than his triumphs. It required loving each of his children, without pretending the circumstances surrounding their family were simple or fully resolved. It required standing beside former family members at weddings, graduations, and public milestones, fully aware that the family structure he once presented to the world had permanently, irreversibly changed. For decades, Arnold's guiding philosophy had rested on the idea of control, controlling his body, his schedule, his public image, and ultimately the outcome of nearly every situation he entered. Age has taught him, often painfully, that life eventually becomes a negotiation with forces no one can fully command. A heart can fail regardless of how it is trained. A marriage can end despite genuine effort to preserve it. Children can carry pain that a parent, however remorseful, cannot simply remove on their behalf. In response, Arnold has continued doing the one thing he has always known how to do: keep working. He has continued promoting fitness, not as a pathway to vanity, but increasingly as a foundation for basic health and self-respect, particularly among people who feel it's too late for them to start. He has spoken about environmental responsibility and civic participation, using the platform his fame afforded him to push causes that extend well beyond his own personal story. He has used humor, a trait that has remained consistent across every phase of his public life, to stay connected with younger audiences who never watched him dominate a bodybuilding stage or open a Terminator film in theaters. Some observers view this later career pivot skeptically, as a calculated effort at image rehabilitation following the scandal that ended his marriage. Others see it as genuine personal growth, the natural result of a man confronting his own mortality and choosing to use whatever time remains more deliberately. The honest answer likely sits somewhere between those two interpretations, because public figures, like anyone else, are rarely driven by a single, uncomplicated motive. What Arnold has emphasized more consistently in these later years, in interviews and in his own public writing, is the debt he owes to the people who helped build his success alongside him. Trainers who pushed him decades ago. Teachers who helped him learn a new language in a new country. Business partners who took early risks on an improving bodybuilder turned actor. Directors, like James Cameron, who saw potential in him when studio executives did not. Surgeons and nurses who kept his heart functioning through multiple emergency procedures. Family members who remained connected to him even after profound public disappointment. That list stands in direct contrast to the myth Arnold spent much of his career projecting. The idea of a completely self-made man who willed his entire life into existence through personal effort alone. Age has taught him, and he has increasingly been willing to say publicly, that even the most extraordinary individual achievement rests on a foundation built by other people. That honesty is precisely where the emotional weight of Arnold Schwarzenegger at 79 actually comes from. He is no longer simply the flawless, larger-than-life figure frozen in old bodybuilding photographs or classic action film posters. He is no longer only the character who walked through fire and stood back up. He is a man whose face and posture now visibly carry the years he once appeared capable of defeating entirely through discipline alone. Watching him age forces audiences, whether they realize it consciously or not, to confront their own relationship with time. The people who grew up watching Arnold on screen have grown older themselves, built families of their own, faced their own health scares, and experienced their own losses. Seeing him visibly older can feel, for many longtime fans, like watching an entire era quietly grow old alongside him. The sadness in that recognition has little to do with any single tragic event in Arnold's life. It has to do with the simple, unavoidable fact that time has, at last, caught up with someone who spent decades convincing the world it never would. And yet, within that sadness, there remains something genuinely inspiring about how Arnold has chosen to respond to it. He did not disappear from public life once physical perfection became impossible to maintain. He did not retreat simply because his body changed shape, his marriage ended in public disgrace, or his cultural relevance shifted with each passing decade. He has continued accepting public appearances, telling honest stories about his own failures alongside his successes, offering practical advice to strangers, and showing up consistently for the people still in his life. That continued presence may be the final, quietest transformation in a life defined by dramatic reinventions. The first transformation turned a poor Austrian teenager into a champion bodybuilder. The second turned that champion into one of the biggest movie stars in the world. The third turned a movie star into an elected political leader governing millions of people. This final transformation, still unfolding, has turned a global icon into something more ordinary and, in many ways, more difficult to achieve. A man willing to be seen as fully human, scars and all. At 79, Arnold Schwarzenegger does not need to prove to anyone that he was once extraordinarily powerful. The evidence of that is everywhere, preserved in his films, his bodybuilding records, his political tenure, and his continued cultural influence on fitness and popular culture around the world. The more difficult and more interesting question, the one his life now poses to anyone watching closely, is what kind of man remains once the muscles fade, the film offers slow down, and the applause becomes something closer to memory than a daily occurrence. What remains, based on everything Arnold has shown publicly in these later years, is discipline that has adapted rather than disappeared, humor that has softened without losing its edge, an acknowledgement of responsibility that took years to arrive but appears genuine, and a family history that is simultaneously loving and permanently marked by damage that cannot be fully repaired. What remains, above all, is the simple determination to keep waking up and keep moving forward, even without a clear victory waiting at the end of it. Arnold Schwarzenegger spent much of his life teaching the world how to build an extraordinary body, pursue an apparently impossible dream, and refuse to accept limits that other people tried to impose on him. His final lesson, still being written in real time as he moves through his late 70s, appears to be considerably quieter than any of those earlier ones, but arguably more important. No one, regardless of how disciplined or determined they are, ultimately defeats time. No one moves through a life as consequential as is without making mistakes that cause real harm to the people closest to them. No one, not even a man once marketed globally as the most physically indestructible figure in cinema, remains truly invincible. But as long as life continues, a person retains the ability to choose honesty over continued denial, to choose service to others over pure self-interest, and to choose connection over isolation, even after the most public and painful kind of failure. The hero, in this final chapter of Arnold's story, does not get a clean, triumphant ending. He simply keeps walking, imperfect and visibly aged, toward whatever time remains. That, in the end, may be exactly why watching Arnold Schwarzenegger at 79 carries such genuine emotional weight for so many people who grew up admiring him. This is not the story of a legend suddenly falling from grace, nor is it a simple tale of decline. It is a far more complicated and far more human experience of watching someone the world once believed to be untouchable slowly, publicly become mortal in front of us, while still carrying forward everything he gained across an extraordinary life, everything he lost through his own choices and through the ordinary cruelty of time, and everything he still, even now, quietly hopes he might be able to repair before his story finally comes to its close.